Over the past several weeks, the members of the UN Security Council, both the permanent members who have veto power, which is the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia, have been arduously negotiating with the other 10 members, with the General Assembly at large, a resolution that would finally bring to an end the horrific war that Israel has been waging in Gaza. And essentially the entire world got behind a resolution and the content of it, which most of the world, if not all of the world supports. And yet earlier today, and this is the fourth time this has happened in the last year, the United States separated itself from the world to stand alone and the UN Security Council and use its veto power to prevent approval of the resolution that obviously the United States does not want Israel to end this war, even though the United States is paying for it, arming it, and doing everything possible to continue it. And it wasn't just that the U.S. used its veto power, it was that the U.S. stood alone as the only country in opposition to it. Here's the video of what happened earlier today at the UN.
Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024-835 please raise their hand? Those against?
There you see the UN representative. Usually it's the UN ambassador, but that is her deputy, and he alone raised his hand. You see the British representative who is presiding over the UN Security Council. She herself raised her hand in favor of the resolution, one of the US's closest allies, a major ally of Israel as well, the UK, also France. Every other member of this body, except the United States, that just raised its hand and voted no, standing alone to do so for the fourth time in the last year.
The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
Now, you can say if you want, well, who cares? The United States should just follow its policy preferences and do what it wants, and who cares what the rest of the world thinks? But so many vital U.S. interests depend upon the U.S. being part of the international community, of having allies that respect it, which believe that it's acting morally in the world. And the more the U.S. isolates itself in order to protect wars like the one in Ukraine or the one in Gaza, the more China's argument that the world is better off with China rather than a world led by the United States as a rogue nation using military force around the world to promote its own interests becomes more persuasive. And that's why so many countries have been migrating away from US and Western influence toward the influence of the Chinese. The US has a long history of doing exactly this. Here from Middle East Eye earlier today regarding the history, the 49 times the US used veto power against UN resolutions on Israel. Quote, in the past year alone, Washington has vetoed 4 Security Council resolutions calling for a Gaza ceasefire. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, the U.S. has used its veto power 48 other times against draft Security Council resolutions pertaining to Israel since it first began using it in 1970. The first, Resolution S-10784, expressed deep concern, quote, at the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and was aimed at Israeli aggression on the Lebanese border. In 1975, the year's civil war broke out in Lebanon. Resolution S-11898 called on, quote, Israel to desist forthwith from all military attacks against Lebanon. Again, the U.S. was the only veto. The U.S. vetoed similar resolutions in 1985, 1986, and 1988. Resolutions condemning Israeli settlements considered illegal under international law were blocked only by the U.S. in 1983, 1997, and 2011. In 2004 and 2006, the U.S. refused to call on Israel to halt wars against Gaza, which together killed hundreds of civilians. In June 2018, the U.S. vetoed a Kuwait-drafted measure that condemned Israel's use of force against Palestinian civilians. Israeli forces had killed dozens of peaceful protesters in Gaza during the March of Return protests. Since the beginning of the war, the U.S. has blocked a resolution aimed at recognizing Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. And the question that I would submit to you is, why does the U.S. government continue to throw away its own moral standing in the world? a vital form of soft power for our government. And to allow China to intensify its argument with much greater efficiency and persuasiveness that the U.S. is a bad actor in the world, a rogue country that just does what it wants on its own and uses its military force to throw around and do so. Why is this one foreign country so worth giving up so much for? $4 billion every year right out the door, paying for all their wars, paying for their military, giving them everything they want, protecting them in every way, vowing publicly with loyalty oaths to always do anything that Israel demands, both members of both political parties. Why does this continue to happen? If you really want the answer, you can read the great book in 2006 called The Israel Lobby by Professors John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. I'm really asking a rhetorical question. We've covered this many times before. One of the key anchors of the Israel Lobby, AIPAC, celebrated this veto today and gave the U.S. government, the Biden administration, a pat on the head for their compliant behavior. Here's AIPAC tweeting, "Thank you, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, for vetoing this morally bankrupt Security Council resolution." Just as a context, the key context for why this is going on now, there have been all sorts of reports, increasingly documented reports, and not just from whatever agencies people have been trained to regard as steadfastly anti-Israel or anti-Semitic or whatever. Basically, any media outlet, any aid organization that has ever contradicted the Israeli government or criticized it in any way immediately gets branded anti-Semitic, signaling to people that they're supposed to ignore it and explain away everything they conclude, everything they observe, everything they document as a byproduct of hatred for Jews. But there are all sorts of aid organizations, including Oxfam, that deals with world hunger, led by Cindy McCain, the widow of John McCain, who was a stalwart supporter of Israel his whole life, that has been warning that famine is killing people in Gaza. Famine, mass famine, deliberately imposed as a result of blockade of humanitarian aid. Here's the BBC today, just as one example. Their headline, "Virtually no aid has reached besieged North Gaza in 40 days, the UN says." As you may recall, the Biden administration, right before the election, 2 weeks or so, issued a letter to Israel saying, "You're blocking humanitarian aid and food from getting into northern Gaza. We don't find that acceptable. If you don't make strides and progress toward reversing that, we will consider seriously cutting off arms shipments to you within 30 days." So the date fell conveniently after the election. And the Israelis made very clear they weren't going to do any of that. They laugh at the U.S. every time the U.S. issues these red lines or demands. In fact, Israel went backwards. They imposed more stringent blockades. They prevented even more food from entering northern Gaza. There's a humanitarian crisis in northern Gaza of a kind that's difficult to explain. I would need the whole show and more to do it. And then, of course, when it came time at the end of 30 days for the U.S. government, the State Department, under Joe Biden, to say whether they were going to cut off aid as they threatened to do, given that there's no progress, the State Department fabricated progress that Israel supposedly made that no one in the world believes they actually made, even while speaking out of the other side of their mouth and saying that the Israelis need to do more. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.